I stumbled across Isaiah 59 when I was preparing our Advent series, which you know was Isaiah 40 through 55. And I have been just captivated by this text, because both its content and its context speak so powerfully to our own situation. The people who originally heard this text were in a society that was coming unraveled. And we are as well. No, we haven't been overrun by foreign hordes. But the evidence of societal decay can be seen all around us, and not necessarily, or at least not always, in the ways that fundamentalist pastors predicted in the 1980s. Decay works that way. It can show up in strange and unpredictable places, like a cancer that has metastasized. Now, how do we explain what is happening in our society? How do we explain what is happening in our world? How do we explain the suffering that seems to be the common inheritance of all humanity? How would the people of Israel have explained their situation? Humans are nothing if not curious, and we love to try to explain things. We love to try to understand them. It gives us a sense that we have some kind of control. The problem is that our explanations often do as much harm as they do good. Yuval Levine is an Orthodox Jewish scholar working for the American Enterprise Institute. And he has outlined the conflicting explanations proposed in our own society for how to understand the human story as a whole and how to understand suffering in particular. And of course, these alternate explanations have become lenses through which their proponents see the whole world. It's a common human tendency, right? So for the American left, Levine argues, life is about the differentiation of power. It is about, therefore, oppressor versus oppressed. And so in any human conflict, your job is to find out who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed. By contrast, the American right, especially before the rise of populism, tended to think about things through the lens of order versus chaos. Not surprisingly, conservatives tended to see social change as the secretive, hidden forces of chaos trying to tear down everything that good, well-ordered people had built. Right? Now, these explanations gained currency in different political quarters in our society precisely because they do explain some things. Okay? Not only that, but they have deep roots both in the Bible and in moral psychology. Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about how human moral systems across the world emphasize issues of fairness. In our text this morning, it's called justice, right? But they also emphasize the need for order, the need for people to not be a disruptive force in society. Likewise, in the Bible, Old Testament theologians have long argued that Genesis 1 through 11 is really structured around this struggle between order and chaos. And of course, the minor prophets especially, but Isaiah as well, talk at length about the plight of the oppressed and the sin of oppressors. But Levine's argument is that these lenses are problematic when they become the only lens we use, precisely because they obscure more than they reveal. Life is not always about oppressor versus oppressed. It's not always about order versus chaos. Besides, let's look at each one of these things individually. Besides, as Desmond Tutu, former Archbishop of the Anglican Church in South Africa and long-time apartheid opponent, pointed out, yesterday's oppressed can very easily become today's oppressor. And this way of looking at history, where we only evaluate things in terms of power dynamics and who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed, has the sort of perverse result of rewriting history. You know, you've heard the old saying, historians like to say that history is written by the winners. Well, this is a way for history to be written by the losers. And it assumes that if you're the one who lost, then you must be virtuous. You must be the oppressed, which by definition makes you virtuous. Likewise, the order versus chaos people, because that's all they see, they never actually acknowledge the fact that sometimes order is achieved at the expense of oppression, at the expense of suppressing the rights and the well-being of other people. Now, I think it's important for us to think about these issues in light of what we're going to talk about today, because God is addressing Israel's suffering in Isaiah 59. But he doesn't address it by saying, hey, these Babylonians, they're just terrible oppressors and we're just going to get rid of them. They're the only thing that's wrong here. There are texts in the prophets that talk about Babylonian oppression, but that's not what God chooses to do here. As his people cry out for salvation, he doesn't talk about, oppression or oppressed. Not directly. We'll talk about how he does talk about that in a moment. He doesn't talk about, first and foremost, order and chaos and how rules have been violated or laws have been. No. He begins not with a lens for them to look outward. He begins with a mirror. And what is the concept that God uses to form that mirror? It's the concept of sin. Right? Sin is God's starting point. Sin is God's lens. But it doesn't function like a lens for the people who hear this. It functions like a mirror. And sin, as a concept, has several functions. It disabuses us of our notions of innocence. Now, we're going to have to come back and talk about that concept of innocence, because it's a much bigger concept, I think, than we sometimes think of when we're thinking theologically, okay? But for now, we're just going to leave that aside and just say, however you understand innocence, sin disabuses us of the notion that we live in innocence. And by doing so, sin also reminds us of our common humanity. We all are embedded within this world that is framed by sin, that is saturated with sin. Come back to that point, like I said, in a moment. Sin also turns our attention to suffering. Because when we start looking in that mirror, when we start looking fully at ourselves, the way that this text calls the people of God to look at themselves, we begin to see the connection between our sin and the suffering that it inflicts on others, but also between the sin of others and the suffering that it has inflicted on us or on other people. And then that turns our attention to this question of the relationship between sin and depression. You see, our text does talk about that question of justice, that question of fairness, that question of doing right by people in a public, institutional setting. But it does so in a way that is contextualized by this whole concept of sin. Now, I realize what I've done here is I've thrown a whole lot of concepts at you, right? I've thrown a whole lot of brain work at you. And you might be thinking, what is this, as they said about Paul one time, what is this babbler talking about? My point here is not to provide a comprehensive explanation of everything that this text does, because it does so much. It's simply to crack open the door of your mind. Because it's going to take us a long time to unpack all the ways that sin impacts human life. What Isaiah 59 does is it whets our appetite. It gets us curious. It gets us thinking. Now, how does it do that? Well, we need to make some observations about our text. And it's in those observations that we see how God uses the concept of sin to reshape His people's thinking. Now, the first thing that I want you to observe is, to whom is this text addressed? It is addressed to God's people. Now, that fact in and of itself is shocking. That fact in and of itself ought to cause us to stop and to think. God said these words, not to the pagan Babylonians, not to the Greeks who'd eventually conquer Palestine and desecrate the temple, not to the Romans who would crucify Jesus, but to His very own people. It is a sobering reality. It's not entirely surprising. Peter reminds us that judgment begins with the house of God. but it is still sobering. But that realization does something, I think, very important. Notice the sort of universal tone of this text. No one has escaped this sin-saturated situation that God is describing. Now, God isn't necessarily saying that everybody is guilty of murder, but He's saying that sin is so ubiquitous that it affects everyone among His people. And if sin is that ubiquitous among His people, then I think we can infer that sin is simply a universal experience. Okay? There was a professor at Bright Divinity School who argued that really the Old Testament doesn't talk about a fall. It doesn't talk about this thing of sort of original sin or whatever. That's kind of a New Testament imposition. And she's right that Adam is almost never mentioned in the rest of the Old Testament. But she's wrong about everything else. The notion of universal sinfulness is implied on virtually every page of the Old Testament. It's all over the prophets. It's all over the Psalms. It's all over Proverbs. And this text is just right in line with that conviction. Now, the second thing that I want you to observe is the context in which this address is made to God's people. Look there at verse 1. It's almost as if God is asking a rhetorical question. Did I not put my hearing aid in this morning? Did I not do my weightlifting today, so I can't help you today? No. It's ridiculous. His people desire deliverance, but they also have doubts about their deliverer. It's hard to blame them after everything that they've been through. Not just the Babylonian exile, but all the governmental and societal, cultural and religious decay that preceded it. I mean, go back and read what 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles say about the reign of Manasseh, who was king for more than half a century. It was ugly. It was ugly. And these people are really wondering, okay, does God just not care? Or is He just not able to save us? Have you ever wondered that? For my part, when I've had that struggle, I never doubted God's ability. And so my doubt fell on the side of God's care. And what God does in response is He puts up that mirror we were just talking about. He talks about their sin. Now, the imagery describing how this sin manifested itself is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, it's very, very imaginative and very pointed, I would say. Yet I think we can boil down the ways that sin manifested itself to just a few things here. First of all, Israel's institutions had been corrupted. Now, this is the one that God hits on the hardest. There is this corruption that infiltrated essentially Israel's court system. And you can see very clearly what God is describing. People are constructing arguments. They seem to make sense, if you want them to, but they're entirely contrived. They are entirely disingenuous. They are intended to do nothing but manipulate the institution for their own benefit. Secondly, and I think this is really interesting, they have developed and implemented evil plans. Now, one reason this is an interesting point is because it moves the notion of sin from the hands to the mind. It's not just a matter of what they're actually doing, it's a matter of what they're planning to do. Now, it becomes sin because they're actually doing it. But it has its roots in their mind and in their heart. The other reason I think this is interesting is because of the use of that word, evil. The NIV uses it 2 or 3 times in this text. We'll come back in just a moment to why that's such an interesting choice of word. But they are constructing these plans that are evil. And what are their methods of operation? Deception and violence. Now, what makes deception such an insidious tool is that the deceived are often the last ones to admit that they've been deceived. I just have this image. It wouldn't be in this church, but I just have this image of me preaching this church somewhere and some guy on the back row standing up and saying, "You tell them, preacher." And I look at whatever shirt he happens to have on and think, well, actually, I'm talking to you. But, that's just how this works. The people who are the most deceived are also the most confident in their rectitude. That's what makes these deceptions so insidious. And it wasn't something that just happened in ancient Israel. It is something that's happening in our own day too. I don't remember who said it, but there was someone that I was listening to on the Trinity Forums podcast, and they talked about the outrage industrial complex. All of these people, on the right especially, but also on the left, who make their money, gain their influence, build their brand by making you mad.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if they have to deceive you or bend the truth a little bit in order to do that, they will. Just Friday, Christianity Today's news podcast, The Bulletin, had a section on fake news on Facebook and other social media outlets, and what works and what doesn't, and sort of kind of keeping that stuff down, and where does suppression of free speech come in, and blah 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 blah, and all. They had this really nice discussion. But one of the things that came out of that discussion, from people who know a heck of a lot more about algorithms than I do, is that one of the problems is the algorithms themselves. They drive people to stay engaged in the platform. And what keeps you engaged in the platform? some kind of conspiracy theory that tells you if you keep digging down this rabbit hole, you'll find eventually the truth that they, whoever they happens to be, are trying to hide from you. The ubiquitous they, right? That's what keeps you engaged. All that is a modern version of whatever was going on in ancient Israel. And then, of course, once we are deceived, we will use any means to accomplish our goals, including violence. We've seen that in our country too. And we will stand up with a straight face and say the ends justify the means. Well, ancient Israel was doing the same thing. Here's the problem. There's some guy or gal behind the scenes pulling the strings, and they're the ones really profiting. And they're deceiving people and driving people to violence in order to benefit themselves. These are the ways that sin manifested itself in ancient Israel, as God explains it here. And everything that's old is new again. Now, what are the consequences of this kind of sin? Well, the first one is right there in verse 2. The sin is so ubiquitous that it has literally separated people from God. Now, we want to be careful theologically here because, some people will say, well, if you're a sinner, God won't hear your prayer. Well, if that's true, God would never hear anything. God would be deaf. He'd never hear any prayer from anybody on earth because we all sin. But there is a critical mass when we as a people cannot reach God because sin has so saturated our lives, our hearts, our minds, our hands, that we are completely out of step with His will and His character anyway. So of course we're hidden from the face of God. We're going the opposite direction He is. Another thing that happens is that no human flourishing exists. These people, they come up with these plans and they sell them to us, or maybe we sell them to other people, saying, oh, this is going to make everything better. It's the argument made by every totalitarian movement that has ever been. One of the things that makes a totalitarian movement work, according to the people who study this and know a lot more about it than I do, Hannah Arendt and others, is that you have to have a scapegoat. And so what do? They say, well, if we just slaughter this group of people over here, if we just get rid of them, then all the things that you're mad about will go away and we'll all be better off. That's not human flourishing. That's the exact opposite of it. That's what God is talking about here, down in verses 7 and 8, when He's talking about, anybody has the misfortune to be on the same path as these sinners, you're not going to have any peace. You're not going to have any justice. You're going to be the victim of bloodshed. Right? Now, that's a rather extreme example, totalitarian movements. Not as extreme as I wish it was, but, it's a rather extreme example. But God, kind of draws it down to more brass tacks, to more daily life too. Okay? Notice there in verses 4, 5, 6, you got this wonderful picturesque imagery. It's also terrible imagery about the plans that these people construct. The plans turn into spider webs, which of course, can you imagine trying to wear a spider web? You can't, I mean, yes, people are going to see through it. And nobody wants to see that. And it's kind of cold outside. The spider webs are not going to keep you warm either. And, the eggs, you're not going to be able to eat them. No, because whenever you crush one in your plate to scramble your egg, it's going to turn into a snake and it's going to bite you and you're going to die. I mean, isn't that imagery so powerful? But the use of that word evil, I told you we'd come back to this. The use of that word evil really drives home the point. Because that word evil has another meaning. In fact, it's perhaps the first meaning from which this other meaning comes. The word evil also means calamity or ruin or destruction. Okay? So when God says that their plans are evil plans, their schemes are evil schemes, they are schemes that bring about destruction, that bring about the opposite of shalom, peace, wellness, wholeness. You don't promote human flourishing by encouraging sin. And yet, again, I keep coming back to this point about deception. That's exactly what deceived people think they can do. Well, I can find a shortcut to making my life better. It doesn't work that way. And here's the thing about sin. Sin does not stay at the personal level or even at the familial level. It corrupts entire societies, entire cultures. That's, a big part of what God's talking about here. It distorts the institutions, the systems, the structures that are supposed to make a society work. And as those institutions, systems, and structures become distorted, people lose faith in them. And the more that people lose faith in them, the more that they start to resort to wicked, self-serving plans, which then only undermines the institutions even further. It's a death spiral. It's a death spiral for a society. So, from God's point of view, this sin that He is showing to His people has theological, personal, and societal consequences. And they are all bad. Now let's conclude by observing that the people to whom God was talking were a suffering people. And it can feel almost cruel to talk to suffering people about sin. Right? But God does it anyway. Why? In fact, I would argue it has to be done. Why? Well, for one thing, we can't change our own sin if we don't know that it exists, right? But there's a couple of other reasons. Look, sin reminds us about the reality of suffering. We already said that before. And in doing so, what sin does is it makes us ask some really important and really hard questions about the relationship between sin and suffering. It contextualizes the experiences of suffering people. And it causes us to dig into those experiences, not in order to blame them for their own victimhood, but in order to understand the things that made them what they are, the things that hurt them, the things that brought about this pain and suffering and sorrow. Now look, God's words were cold comfort to the elites who had used their elite power to enrich themselves. They were cold comfort to the criminal class who had preyed upon their neighbors and their friends. But what about the people who had been the victims of that kind of egregious behavior? God's words are vindication, aren't they? God's words say, hey, I'm watching and I care. I care about what has happened to you. I am not blind to the way that sin has distorted this society, to the way that sin has hurt your life. I see and I know. And if I may say so, it holds out hope for those who suffer that it will not always be like this. So often, for people who have been hurt, the thing that they need is to be told, you're not crazy. What was done to you was wrong. I've talked about Diane Langberg here before, but this week she was on Russell Moore's podcast. Diane Langberg has 50 years of experience counseling women and men who have been sexually abused, many of them in church settings or by Christian parents or uncles or whatever. And she said that one of the things that is so important is for someone who's been victimized in that way simply to be told, hey, you do know that what happened to you was a crime, don't you? And so often, what happens is they go, oh. It's not just that this feels wrong to me, it actually is wrong. And not just a little bit wrong either. This is really a big deal. That's what God is doing here by pointing out his people's sin. Yes, he is calling them to account because they can't change if they don't know what's wrong. But he's also saying to them, I see and I know. And you're not wrong. You're not crazy for thinking that this is not how it should be. Let us pray.